Mithridates was a leader known by a Persian name meaning sent by Mithras, the ancient Persian sun god. Descended from the Persian royal dynasty and a descendant of Alexander the Great, Mithridates saw himself as the unifier of East and West and the defender of the East against Roman domination. A man of superior intellect and fiery ambition, Mithridates bravely resisted the Roman Republic. His father was poisoned to death, but Mithridates survived several poisoning attempts and developed immunity by experimenting with poisons. After his death, Mithridates' potion was used by many people, from Roman emperors to Chinese high officials. Mithridates was also a patron of science and the arts, making significant advances in military engineering, and is believed to have been the author of the Antikythera device, the world's first computer. Mithridates' goal was to unite the West and the East and establish a great Black Sea empire. The Romans, despite their best generals, could not cope with him and could not tame him. Mithridates became a legend in his own time and was recognized as Rome's greatest enemy. As a Persian leader who idealized democratic Greece, he saw Rome as barbaric and dreamed of uniting Greek and Eastern cultures. Mithridates was a brave warrior, strategist, poison scholar, scientific researcher, lover, and art enthusiast. Under his leadership, the Wars of Mithridates made even Rome appreciate its most implacable enemy. In 88 BC, a revolt against Rome took place in a number of cities in Anatolia, led by Mithridates, and thousands of Romans were slaughtered. Although the Romans had a large population among the settlers in Anatolia, Mithridates' resistance deeply affected them and created a deep hatred of Rome. Many who traded, collected taxes, and built settlements for the Romans were hated by the local population and joined Mithridates' resistance. Mithridates' resistance became a symbol of an era that questioned Rome's dominance in Anatolia. This shaping of Mithridates' life seems to have made him an unusual and impressive leader. His father and his childhood experiences seem to have shaped his abilities and character. His willingness to thwart poisoning attempts and his eventual immunity to poisons show his scientific curiosity and intelligence. At the same time, his childhood imagination of himself as a great savior points to his leadership abilities and aspirations. The conspiracies and massacres surrounding Mithridates seem to have reinforced his identity as a political strategist and warrior. The fact that he saw himself as a bridge between East and West emphasizes his cultural and diplomatic mastery. Moreover, his resistance against Rome and the battles that challenged Roman power reflect his determination and courage. The various aspects of Mithridates' life reveal him as both a legendary hero and a complex historical figure. His combination of political strategy, scientific curiosity, cultural vision, and leadership skills make him one of the most interesting and impressive leaders of the ancient world. The story of Mithridates indeed appears to be one of the most interesting and complex characters of antiquity. Beginning with the death of his father and his subsequent accession to the throne, it seems to mark a period of palace intrigue and dangerous political games. It is interesting how Mithridates grew up under the influence of different cultures and how these interactions shaped his personality and vision. In particular, his passion for the science of poison and how his knowledge in this field developed is intriguing. At the same time, how he would strategize against the rising power of Rome and how he would relate to the political players around him seems to be an important problem. This text covers Mithridates' youth and ascension to the throne in great detail. These details, which are crucial for understanding his character and his environment, help us to better understand Mithridates as a historical figure. The story of Mithridates is indeed extraordinary and exciting. His struggle against his enemies shows what a determined and courageous leader he was. Despite palace intrigues and dangerous political games, Mithridates seems to have acted bravely to defend himself and protect his reign. Also noteworthy are his relationships with various ethnic groups and his desire to understand their cultures. In particular, his interaction with the Tower people mentioned by Strabo and his winning them as allies is an interesting detail. Establishing relations with and winning over such ethnic groups shows Mithridates' political acumen and leadership skills. The fact that Mithridates feels strong and invincible, that he is impatient to act, and that his friends agree with him emphasizes his leadership qualities and determination. His belief that it was time to seize power and realize his goals makes his story even more interesting. There were many reasons for Mithridates' political and military successes. First of all, he was noted for his strategic acumen and diplomatic skills. By making the right moves in the right place at the right time, he was able to gain allies and weaken his rivals. For example, by controlling pirates and nomadic tribes in the Black Sea, he ensured maritime trade and the security of the region. Militarily, by building a disciplined army of Greek mercenaries and a fleet of experienced sailors, he established a strong defensive and offensive force. He also strengthened his territory by building fortresses and controlling strategic areas. These fortresses were used not only for defense, but also as warehouses and supported the movements of his army in times of war. Economically, he encouraged trade and increased revenues by implementing tax policies in a balanced manner. He also benefited from the Silk Road trade and the rich resources of the Black Sea. He also generated revenue by controlling piracy and supporting pirates. Diplomatically, it maintained regional stability by establishing friendly relations with neighboring kingdoms and ensuring their security. At the same time, he took advantage of Rome's internal problems and foreign wars to divert Roman attention and strengthen his own kingdom. As a result, under Mithridates' leadership, Pontus rose as a regional power and became the ruler of the Black Sea. However, it had to constantly develop new strategies to cope with the continuing power and influence of Rome. Mithridates' political and military strategy was complex, and he sought to strengthen his empire by exploiting the balance of power in various regions. In particular, the intrigues and struggles in Bithynia, Paphlagonia, Cappadocia, and Galatia demonstrated his political ingenuity. The treaty with Nicomedes III, the king of Bithynia, aimed to attract the attention of Rome. This treaty was based on the strategy of taking advantage of Rome's weak position at that time. Moreover, the cunning games in Paphlagonia reflected Mithridates' efforts to use his diplomatic skills and military power to increase his influence in the region. The situation in Cappadocia was similarly complex. Under the influence of Mithridates' sister Laodicea, the king of Cappadocia and his children were important figures influencing Mithridates' goals. Gordios seems to have played a critical role in the realization of Mithridates' goals, and through his family Mithridates sought to increase his influence in the region. Mithridates' political maneuvering was not limited to the eastern regions. He also tried to manipulate the balance of power in the west by communicating with rebel groups against Rome and influencing the Danubian Gauls with gifts. In addition, by establishing relations with regions such as Greece, Egypt, and Parthia, he was effectively conducting diplomacy in a wide geography. The complexity and effective implementation of Mithridates' strategies to realize his goals made him one of the most powerful and feared leaders of his time. The arrival of Marius and Sulla in Anatolia seems to reflect the internal turmoil and power struggles in Rome. While Marius' popularist faction sought to increase the power of the plebeians, Sulla focused on protecting the interests of the patrician class. The rivalry between these two leaders deepened to the point that it led to the beginning of bloody civil wars in Rome. Marius' arrival in Anatolia resulted in him visiting regions such as Cappadocia and Galatia. Sulla was making preparations to seize power in Rome. This situation was affecting the balance and political atmosphere in Rome. Marius' encounter with Mithridates seems to show how strong and confident both leaders were with each other. Marius' farewell speech to Mithridates seems to encourage him to challenge Rome. However, it is clear that Mithridates has no intention of submitting to Rome. Mithridates' strategic moves complicate his relations with Rome. In particular, the efforts of Nicomedes and Laodicea to form an alliance with Rome seem to be affecting Mithridates' plans. However, Mithridates shows that he is prepared for Roman intervention in Cappadocia and turns eastwards, especially towards Armenia. The alliance with Tigranes appears to be part of Mithridates' strategy to gain power and resist Rome. The political intrigues and power struggles of this period reflect the complex relationships of kings and leaders seeking to limit Rome's influence in the east. Mithridates' strategic moves and his alliance with Tigranes can be seen as a challenge to Roman influence in the east. In the process, events in Anatolia and the surrounding regions illustrate the complexity and difficulties of Rome's eastern policy. Mithridates launched a resistance against Roman oppression by supporting Socrates Chrestos in place of Nicomedes IV's weak son, Nicomedes IV. However, assassination attempts against Nicomedes IV fail and Nicomedes IV remains on the throne. In order to distract Rome, Mithridates sends emissaries to the tribes north and west of the Black Sea, and tries to attract the Roman legions in Bithynia to his side. Meanwhile, the Roman Senate sent Manius Aquilius to restore order in the province of Asia. Aquilius' task is to convince Ariobarzanes, who is not willing to send troops and taxes to Rome, to support Nicomedes IV in Bithynia. However, Aquilius' decisions, which challenged Rome's traditional foreign policy, caused great tension between Rome and Mithridates. As a result, a major war broke out between the two powers, significantly affecting the balance of power in the region. Mithridates had little experience in warfare, but he proved himself in an important battle by leading the forces he assembled in Sinope. With the help of his ally Tigranes, he assembled an impressive navy with a large number of warships and pirate troops. He imitated the bold moves of the Macedonian king Philippos by assigning his son Archothios to lead much of the battle. He used chariots equipped with scythes for a surprise attack behind his troops. As the battle began, Mithridates' tactical acumen was evident in the first engagement with Nicomedes' army. Archothios' cavalry broke the enemy's ranks, buying them time. However, as the battle continued, Nicomedes' generals tried to stabilize the situation by counterattacking. Mithridates' chariots attacked, surprising the enemy and causing great confusion. At the end of the battle, Nicomedes' army suffered great losses and was defeated. With Mithridates' victory, regions such as Bithynia, Galatia, Cappadocia, and Phrygia came under his control. Mithridates won the support of the people with his compassion for prisoners of war and social reforms. He also aimed to conquer Greece and the Aegean Sea against Rome. These victories caused great concern and mobilization in the Roman Senate. Sulla's preoccupation with civil war and Rome's economic difficulties strengthened Mithridates' hand. Rome's military response was delayed, giving Mithridates more time to attack Rhodes. In between Mithridates' political and personal honeymoons, he savored his victories and plotted revenge against Aquilius. He felt he deserved the death penalty for invading Rome. Mithridates' ushers gathered the people at the theater of Dionysus in Pergamon. They planned to carry out Aquilius' sentence in public. While enjoying his victories, Mithridates continued to take anti-Roman steps. However, Mithridates' execution of Aquilius in 88 BC was overshadowed by the subsequent cold-blooded massacre of Italian settlers in Asia Minor. After Mithridates had dispersed the Roman coalition armies, he fled before the Romans and their supporters. The fact that the Italians sought safety by encamping in temples ultimately increased the impact of the massacre under Mithridates' successful command. An analysis of Mithridates' personal characteristics and strategies reveals a confident, charismatic, and ambitious leader. However, he also exhibited some psychopathological traits. However, he drew a profile that could be called a successful psychopath. These characteristics seem to have influenced his political and military strategies. Taking Mithridates' attack on Rhodes as a historical indicator, it is noteworthy that the experienced and brave Rhodians used their defensive advantages to repel Mithridates' attacks. The battles, which showcase the technical and strategic skills of both sides, have taken their place among the great battles that will be remembered throughout history. Mithridates' attack on Rhodes went unexpectedly awry and was inconclusive. The giant siege machine, the Sambuca, was attacked by the goddess Isis' fireball as it tried to breach the walls of the temple and was burned to the sea. This failure ended Mithridates' hopes of capturing Rhodes. Mithridates' rule extended from the Black Sea and most of western Anatolia to Greece. His navy dominated the Aegean Sea, and his plan to destroy the Romans in Asia was successful. Mithridates' financial resources increased, he gained great popular admiration, and his armies were invincible. His generals marched forward to carry out Mithridates' campaign against Greece. Everything now depends on Mithridates' expedition to Greece. Mithridates was closely following the news from Greece and the civil war in Italy. The civil war in Italy was raging between the supporters of Sulla and Marius. Sulla had captured and controlled Rome and was clashing with those who sided with Marius. However, Marius' mobs had mobilized against Sulla, and Sulla's family was in grave danger. This confusion might tie Mithridates' hands for a while, but it was thought to give him an advantage. Mithridates' generals attacked Roman-controlled Delos and sacked the city. This attack led to thousands of powerful slaves breaking free from Roman shackles and joining Mithridates' liberation army. They also killed the Italian merchants in Delos and sold their wives and children into slavery. Athens, with Mithridates' support, started a revolution and joined the Liberation Army. Archelaus, Mithridates' general, formed the Liberation Army with the support of Athens and other Greek cities. Part of this army was made up of Celts from Galatia. Mithridates divided his forces into 3 separate operations. His son Archelaus and General Taxiles marched into Macedonia and took control of the region. With Mithridates' victories in Greece and the support of Athens, Rome's dominance over the East was seriously shaken. Mithridates' hope was that the civil war in Italy would continue, and that he could use his victories in Greece to get Rome to agree to a new power-sharing arrangement. The force led by Metrophanes had taken Euboea and established a headquarters at Chalcis, and his fleet was advancing towards Thessalia. At the same time, Neoptolemus and Dromicates were on their way to Chalcis from Asia Minor. Doraleus was waiting in Pontus with an army of 80,000 men. Mithridates' 3 armies planned to unite in Macedonia. But to thwart their plans, the commander of the Roman garrison decided on a bold attack. When the battle began, Rome's small forces enjoyed success and were defeated by Metrophanes' marines. Bruttius' small fleet destroyed Metrophanes' ships and forced him to retreat. Bruttius invaded the island, captured the spoils, and took thousands of soldiers prisoner. However, the fate of the captives was cruel. Those born free were freed, but those whose hands had been cut off were crippled so that they could never use weapons again, and runaway slaves were executed by crucifixion. This failure may have angered Mithridates, but he could boast of his successes. After his expulsion from the Roman province of Asia Minor, Mithridates ruled Bithynia, Cappadocia, Paphlagonia, and Anatolia. His general Archelaus controlled the Aegean and Greece. His son Mithras became regent of Bosporus, and Archelaus, with his success in Macedonia, ruled the lands that would later become his kingdom. However, Sulla needed money and a navy to obtain the resources needed to return to Rome and destroy Mithridates' forces in Greece. However, he could expect no help from the Roman Senate because Sulla had been declared a public enemy of Rome. When Sulla's ships crossed the Adriatic, Cinna broke his peace oath and declared war against Sulla. She sacked the temples of Olympia and Epidaurus to raise money so that Sulla could adequately feed his forces in Greece. In Athens, hunger and thirst had set in. Sulla's army besieged Athens and captured the city. This attack caused massive destruction of ancient Athens, and Sulla executed Aristion, the last leader of democratic Athens. Meanwhile, Archelaus and Sulla faced each other at Phocis, where Sulla reportedly had a large army. This conflict threatened Mithridates' success in Greece. The large size of Mithridates' armies and the different nationalities they included posed a real challenge to Rome. Rome's former slaves, Greeks, Pirates, Thracians, Macedonians, Bastarnae, Sarmatians, Scythians, Tauri, Maeotians, and many other groups had come together. This was a diversity and complexity that the Roman army had rarely encountered before. The different languages and cultures in Mithridates' army posed management challenges for the generals. Discord between the different groups and breakdowns in the chain of command often led to confusion and disorder. This created an advantageous situation for the Romans. Sulla's spies had located the position of Archelaus' army and learned that his camp was located on high ground. Taking this information into consideration, Sulla determined his strategy accordingly and planned the attack. In the course of the battle, Archelaus' army was at a disadvantage. The repulse of the cavalry and the ineffectiveness of the chariots in the face of Sulla's offensive led to the disintegration of Archelaus' army. The Romans won a major victory and took thousands of prisoners. However, Sulla's victory was overshadowed because he was shaken by bad news from Rome. There had been a great massacre led by Cinna and Marius, and preparations were being made to replace Sulla with Flaccus. This caused support and confidence in Sulla to wane and further complicated the situation in Rome. Sulla's tactical skills and the loyalty of his legions had indeed played an important role in his victory at Boeotia. The Roman legions had defeated Mithridates' army by acting in a disciplined manner and fighting in a coordinated manner under Sulla's leadership. Mithridates' army, on the other hand, was brave and determined, but their supply lines and complex mix of different cultures affected their ability to fight. Sulla's military genius enabled him to discover the enemy army's weak points and exploit them strategically. For example, he cut the enemy's supply lines, leaving them short of food and thus neutralizing their attacks. The different fighting styles and languages of the different groups in Mithridates' army led to problems of coordination and discipline. The ancient Greek hoplites of Dorilaos had difficulties against the more modern and flexible fighting tactics of the Romans. Archelaus' escape after defeat, hiding in the swamp, shows his cunning and determination to survive. This suggests that Mithridates' army could still be an active threat despite its defeat. Archelaus' return to Chalkis to reassemble the army shows Mithridates' intention and resilience to continue his war strategy. Mithridates' situation was complex. First of all, he had the strategic advantage of holding the island of Euboea and relying on his generals in the Aegean. However, he had concerns about the loyalty of the Galatian soldiers in Archelaus' army. Since Galatians were known to be prone to treachery, it was thought that some of Sulla's support might be Galatian. Mithridates invited 60 princes from Galatia as guests and put them under surveillance. However, it turned out that some Galatian princes, such as Pordorix, were plotting treason. The assassination attempt, designed to ensure Mithridates' survival, was discovered and foiled in time. This incident showed how alert Mithridates was to internal dangers. Mithridates recognized the potential treachery on the island of Chios and acted swiftly. The surprise attack with Zenobio's army and the subsequent move to free the Chiosians was a strategy to increase Mithridates' propaganda power and popular support. However, Mithridates' plans were complicated by the reluctance of the people of Chios to accept this situation due to its history of slave trade. The assassination of Zenobio's further complicated Mithridates' position in Greece and western Anatolia. Faced with rebellions and betrayals, Mithridates began to doubt the reliability of even his closest friends. Lucullus' attempt to raise a navy and other hostile actions caused Mithridates to reassess his war strategy and allies. The negotiated agreement between Sulla and Archelaus provided certain advantages for both sides. However, this agreement was contrary to Mithridates' interests. The illness of Archelaus and Sulla's attention caused Mithridates to reassess his tactics to deal with internal strife and external threats. Mithridates was struggling with the difficult circumstances of an Italy in the midst of civil war and the return of Sulla. Before the peace treaty had even been ratified, an unexpected parallel war loomed. What happened to Sulla's rival Flaccus affected the way Mithridates dealt with the Roman armies. The death of Flaccus through Fimbria's treachery led the Roman Senate to declare Fimbria an outlaw. Under the threat of Fimbria, Mithridates faced 2 roving Roman armies on his territory. However, Fimbria's situation was complicated by Sulla's concerns. Mithridates had to flee, fearing Fimbria's actions against him. Events were further complicated by Fimbria's attack on Pergamon and Mithridates' flight, followed by Sulla's appearance. The Peace of Dardanos ended the war between Sulla and Mithridates. But Sulla's soldiers were not satisfied with the peace and began to plunder Mithridates' lands. The war flared up again as Mithridates sought revenge and tensions increased with Murina's attack on Cappadocia. Mithridates chose to make peace with the Romans and continue his war against Sulla. Eventually, with his victory over Murina, he regained popular support and Mithridates was hailed as the savior of the people against Roman aggression. As Sulla's dictatorship continued in Rome, many of Marius' supporters fled Italy. These fugitives, populace in high positions such as former soldiers and government officials, banded together to rebel on the empire's eastern and western borders. Some joined the Roman commander Sertorius in Spain. Others went to join Mithridates. These experienced Roman officers arrived with 6,000 soldiers to train Mithridates' armies in Roman discipline and tactics. Mithridates lived in peace with Rome, using the Peace of Dardanus he had obtained from Sulla. But to ensure the security of the Black Sea Empire, he prepared an army against the Achaeans in Colchis. The Achaeans were a tribe known for sinking ships on rocky shores and sacrificing sailors. Although their mountainous terrain was difficult to fight in, Mithridates fought them through ambushes and freezing snows. The Achaemenians were never defeated, and although some even joined Mithridates' army, his confidence in them was not complete. Mithridates' life in Cabera involved many projects with scientists, engineers, architects, and artists. Although some of them failed, these projects demonstrated Mithridates' scientific curiosity and wealth. The natural beauty and defensible position of Cabera attracted Mithridates, and he built various structures there. Mithridates' linguistic skills also came to the fore. He was known to be comfortable communicating in many different languages. Mithridates sent peace envoys to Rome in about 80 BC, but Ariobarzanes complained to Sulla, claiming that Mithridates held part of Cappadocia. Sulla ordered Mithridates to leave Cappadocia, as they had agreed at Dardanos. Mithridates obeyed this order and withdrew his army, sending peace envoys back to Rome. However, Sulla's unexpected abdication and death rendered Mithridates' efforts fruitless. Mithridates' envoys returned to Rome without a formal treaty. In Rome, Mithridates' wars were considered unfinished. With Sulla's death, Mithridates realized that Rome was in no position to enforce the treaty. Taking advantage of this situation, Mithridates made an agreement with Tigranes and planned the invasion of Cappadocia. After Tigranes invaded Cappadocia, Mithridates and Tigranes divided the lands and spoils according to the treaty they made in 95 BC. The unraveling of Rome's foreign policy during the civil wars led to an increase in pirate fleets in the Mediterranean. These pirates became allies of Mithridates and Sertorius in Spain. According to Cicero, Mithridates and Sertorius communicated through intelligence couriers on pirate ships. Sertorius encouraged Mithridates to imagine a scenario in which the rebels in Spain and Asia Minor could succeed. Similar to Mithridates, Sertorius rebelled against Rome because of his frustration with the oppressive policies of Rome's provincial administration and his sympathy for the local populations. When Italy was shaken by a violent earthquake in 76 BC, Sertorius won major victories against the Roman armies. Following these victories, in 75 BC, Sertorius and Mithridates began serious negotiations. Mithridates agreed to provide ships and money for a joint war with Rome, in return for recognition of his sovereignty over the province of Asia and the return of the territories he had given up in his treaty with Sulla. Sertorius agreed to Mithridates' subjugation of eastern Anatolia and sent an army under Marcus Varius to Pontus. Mithridates sent Sertorius 40 ships laden with 3,000 silver talents. Mithridates' mints minted large quantities of gold and silver coins in anticipation of war. Together with Sertorius' general Marcus Varius, they captured some cities in Asia. Mithridates, believing that these cities had been liberated from the tyranny of Roman tax collectors, allowed Sertorius' general to enter them as a liberator. He declared the cities free and exempted them from taxation. In Bithynia, Nicomedes IV, called Rome's puppet, died childless in 75-74 BC. Mithridates seized Bithynia, declaring Nicomedes a forgery. This was the spark that started the Third Mithridatic War. Mithridates marched on Bithynia, and the Roman governor Cotta fled to Chalcedon. Cyzicus sent 3,000 hoplites to help Cotta, but the people of Bithynia generally welcomed Mithridates as their savior. With Mithridates' arrival, anxious Romans flocked to Chalcedon and gathered around the city gates, but the gates were closed by Cotta. When Mithridates' army arrived, there was a brutal massacre. Lucullus was chosen to fight Mithridates in 74 BC, and the Senate, fearing that Mithridates might attack Italy with his fleet, allocated 3,000 talents to form a fleet. Lucullus, however, claimed that he did not need a fleet, believing he could defeat Mithridates. Lucullus gathered 3 legions and provoked Mithridates to march on Bithynia, leaving Pontus defenseless. Lucullus' strategic plans gave him pause when he encountered Mithridates' large army. Mithridates sent an army under Sertorius' general Marcus Varius against Lucullus, but when the two armies met at Atrii, they did not fight because of the confusion caused by the fall of a meteorite. The blinding flash of daylight probably symbolized the fall of an incandescent fireball or a large meteorite that had streaked across the sky at lightning speed before the collision. There is no information in the ancient sources on how they explain this event, but it is known that comets, shooting stars, and meteors were feared in Roman times. Although both armies panicked and fled after this event, later both Mithridates and Lucullus may have interpreted it in a positive light. As Mithridates' army encamped on the slopes of the mountains, he sent Metrophanes to blockade the harbor. Cyzicus' hopes were dashed. Lucullus' silence, after the heavy defeat at Chalcedon, had added to his worries. Menacing siege engines built by Mithridates' engineer Niconides began to surround the city walls. Lucullus' intelligence reported that Mithridates' army was foraging for food and obtaining supplies by sea. Lucullus expected Mithridates to surrender from starvation and told his soldiers that with patience they would triumph. However, on the advice of Taxiles, Mithridates blocked Lucullus' advance by holding the mountain pass. As Lucullus' army tried to stomp on Mithridates' stomach, Mithridates' army withdrew the guards from the ravine. While Mithridates' army was demoralized, he heard of Spartacus' victories against Rome in Italy. It was thought that Spartacus was a Thracian and might form an alliance with Mithridates. Mithridates was emboldened by Spartacus' victories and hoped to capitalize on Rome's internal problems in Italy. Lucullus, realizing that Mithridates' army was short of food, pursued him into the mountains. Taking advantage of a snowstorm, Lucullus attacked Mithridates' cavalry near the Rindakos River and defeated them heavily. Lucullus captured many prisoners and supplies from Mithridates' army. This victory further demoralized Mithridates and made the situation more difficult when Galatia allied with Rome. The tight fortifications of Cyzicus, a terrible epidemic and famine, under constant pressure from Lucullus, led Mithridates to believe that he had no choice but to retreat. Interestingly, however, despite the incredible amount of gold in Mithridates' camp, there was no food. As a last resort, Mithridates ordered his admiral Aristonikos to sail with a ship loaded with 10,000 pieces of gold. His aim was to bribe the Romans into allowing him to escape. However, this plan was leaked to Lucullus and the gold was seized by the Romans before the ship even sailed. Mithridates ended the siege of Cyzicus. He sailed secretly through the night to Dardanelles with his fleet, and his infantry set sail by land. But many of them drowned in a river overflowed by heavy snow. Lucullus pursued Mithridates and killed about 20,000 men and took many prisoners. The survivors took refuge in Lampsakos. Lucullus laid siege to the city, but Mithridates sent a fleet of pirates to rescue his soldiers and the townspeople and forced Lucullus to abandon the siege. Excited by his victory, Lucullus quickly returned to Cyzicus and then crossed to the Hellespontos to build a fleet. To complete his victory, he divided his forces among several officers. Voconius sailed east towards Nicomedia to defeat Mithridates. Other officers subjugated the cities of Bithynia, but Appian and Memnon report that in these cities Roman armies fought for booty and Roman civilians were massacred. Mithridates' losses were considerable. In Lucullus' first campaign, some 300,000 of Mithridates' ground forces and camp population were killed or captured. At the height of the storm, Mithridates' ship, heavy with the royal fleet and treasures, was damaged and began to take on water. Only the rescue efforts of the Cilician Admiral Seleucus saved Mithridates' life. Against all odds, Mithridates and the pirates reached Heraclea. Mithridates gathered here to gather support and reconsider his plans. Mithridates appealed to Scythia and Armenia for help, but when this did not arrive, he established garrisons for the defense of Amisos and Sinope. Mithridates deployed scouts and garrisons to monitor Lucullus' movements and retreated to his fortress at Cabera. When the Romans entered western Pontus, they found unprecedented wealth and abundance left behind by Mithridates' army. Lucullus' troops were so overloaded with booty and captives that the excess reduced the value of everything. A male slave was sold for 4 drachmas, an ox for 1 drachma, a day's wages for a soldier. The soldiers had clamored for plunder as they marched into Mithridates' land of plenty, but now they left their worthless booty and captives behind or destroyed them. One day Mithridates went hunting. While chasing a deer, he was intercepted by some Roman cavalry. Lucullus' men shouted for joy as they watched the battle from their high camp. But Mithridates' reinforcements arrived and outnumbered and repulsed the Romans. Lucullus ordered the fleeing cavalry to attack the fleeing cavalry on his horse, which he bravely rode across the plain alone, and thanks to his discipline and courage, he succeeded. In another battle at Cabera, Lucullus' men were winning. This time it was Mithridates, in shining armor, riding alone on his white horse, who rode forward and mobilized his troops. Remarkably fit and brave for a 60-year-old, the king led a formidable cavalry charge that drove the terrified Romans into the foothills and crushed them among the trees. Mithridates sent Menandros to intercept Lucullus' caravan returning from Cappadocia. But the constant stress of battle and unsuccessful engagements frayed nerves and prevented good judgment. Menandros' advanced cavalry caught up with the Roman supply column as it descended a steep path into Pontos. But Menandros could not wait impatiently for the Romans to reach the plain. The cavalry horses slipped down the rocky path, and the Roman infantry managed to throw their men and horses off their skis. Only a few cavalrymen made it to Mithridates' camp before the others. When Mithridates received news of Lucullus' victory, he sent his cavalry after the fugitives. The strict order was to capture the king alive, along with his private papers. Lucullus took charge of the infantry unit that was to capture Guerrilla. But as the city was still a place of confusion and hysteria, Lucullus ordered the soldiers to kill no one and to refrain from looting until order was restored. But the soldiers were furious, having longed for 2 years for plunder, and felt humiliated by their leader's timidity. Dazzled by the dazzling riches of Guerrilla, silver vessels, jewelry, precious stones, heraldic ornaments, exquisite clothing, the Romans grabbed as much booty as they could carry. They set about killing everyone indiscriminately, and Lucullus could not stop it. Lucullus' vanguard of Galatians arrived to block Mithridates' escape. It looked like the end had finally come for one of Rome's most elusive enemies. But Mithridates took out his dagger and cut one of the bags of gold from a mule beside him. As the gold coins scattered to the ground, a scuffle broke out among the Galatians, and Mithridates fled as they collected the gold. Meanwhile, the fugitives from Guerrilla had reached Kamana, the temple of love where Mithridates had spent so much time. They were joined by 2,000 cavalry. Mithridates' small group included important people: General Taxiles, other officers, the field physician Timotheos, the shamans of Agar. Once the supplies were taken care of, the fugitives rode their horses to Talora, where Mithridates had hidden his personal effects and gold, and then rode through the mountain passes into Armenia. The Pontic fleet was no longer superior in the Black Sea, and desertions were rife in his army. Mithridates hoped that his son Macares would make a treaty with the Romans. His only hope for personal salvation was to come under the protection of his father-in-law Tigranes. After the fall of Sinope, Mithridates' son Macares sent Lucullus a golden crown worth 1,000 pieces of gold, officially stating that he wanted to become a friend of Rome. This was a moment when Lucullus believed he had finally ended the war with Mithridates. However, Lucullus was suspicious of the absence of Appius, the man Mithridates was supposed to have brought with him. Lucullus began to organize Pontus as a new Anatolian province. He tried to alleviate the negative effects in Anatolia of Sulla's heavy taxation policies of the previous century. In his first meeting with Tigranes, Appius demanded the surrender of Mithridates. However, Tigranes stated that he would not surrender Mithridates and would protect him. This prevented Lucullus from returning to Rome and declaring victory. The situation was complicated by the fact that Lucullus' plans to expand the war were met with disobedience from his troops and a great outcry in Rome. Leaving his most insecure legions to the Pontic occupation, Lucullus entered Armenia to capture Tigranes and Mithridates, whose whereabouts were unknown. Tigranes, however, had taken precautions to protect Mithridates and provided him with a hunting lodge. During this period, Mithridates shifted to a nomadic life and focused on survival by attacking indirectly. He anticipated that light and flexible cavalry attacks would play a key role in his future battles. Tigranes was generous, providing 10,000 specialized Armenian cavalrymen to help Mithridates. Full of hope, Mithridates began preparations to set off for Pontus with his new army. But Tigranes was worried when he received news that Lucullus had arrived. When he beheaded the messenger, he rationalized the decision because he thought Lucullus had no authority to invade Armenia. But Lucullus was attacking Armenia because of Tigranes' refusal to hand over Mithridates. After executing Tigranes' messenger, no one dared to inform about Lucullus' advance. While Tigranes was making preparations to confront Lucullus' army, his brave general Mithrobarzanes dared to warn his king of the Roman invasion and that Antikythera was under threat. At the same time, Mithridates, with information from his own spies, quickly returned to help Tigranes. This was a dangerous but exciting development. Tigranes had a chance to use his enormous resources to defeat the Romans. But Tigranes decided to attack directly. Despite being vastly outnumbered, he did not listen to Mithridates' wise advice and ignored the strength of the Romans' resolve to fight. As Tigranes' great army marched down the Taurus Mountains, it made the opposite move that Lucullus had expected. Lucullus' small but swift army launched a sudden attack against Tigranes' large force. Tigranes was astonished and could not believe that such a small force could actually attack. This was a tremendous victory for the Romans. Tigranes' army was shattered and began to flee. Tigranes fled into the mountains with his son. In great emotion, he gave his tiara to his son and urged him to flee. He entrusted the tiara to his slave for safekeeping, and he and his father fled into the mountains by different routes. Lucullus' victory came as a great shock to Tigranes and left him frozen by the disaster. When Mithridates found Tigranes distraught on the road, he consoled him and offered Tigranes his own horse. Together, the two set off into the mountains, aiming to reach Artaxerxes. In the process, Mithridates must have re-motivated Tigranes, convincing him that they could still accomplish great things together. This outcome of the war must have reinforced Mithridates' belief that his new indirect strategy was the best way to resist the Romans. With Tigranokerta destroyed, Lucullus protected the wives of dignitaries and arranged for the return of displaced peoples to their homeland. But despite his success, Lucullus ignored the north, where Mithridates and Tigranes were still free. Events during the siege of Samosata showed that Lucullus faced new challenges. Lucullus' euphoria of victory led to the failure of the siege of Samosata through the use of a flammable mud called malva. This mud destroyed the Roman siege engines and melted the soldiers' armor. These attacks forced Lucullus to retreat, and when he entered Gordiane, he was subjected to another biochemical attack. These attacks caused Lucullus to lose many of his men. As discontent grew among Lucullus' troops, he retreated towards the Tigris. Lucullus planned to invade the country of Path, with the dream of achieving great empires. However, the revolt of the legions of Fimbria and discontent among the soldiers began to undermine Lucullus' authority. To strengthen his army, Mithridates trained Armenians as infantry and directed the rest to the production of armor and weapons. Taxiles organized the new army into Roman-style cohorts and taught them the tactics needed to drive the Romans out of Pontus. Mithridates improved his strategy, drawing on the experience of Dareios and Alexander, and strengthened with a large cavalry force from the Caucasus. Mithridates and Tigranes appealed to Parthia for help, storing large quantities of grain and providing money for their troops. But the Parthian king refused to help either side. Mutinies in Lucullus' army caused him to abandon his ambitions for the Parthian Empire. Since Mithridates being alive was still a threat to Rome, Lucullus aimed to draw Mithridates away from Tigranes' protection. When the Romans advanced on Artaxerxes, they were surprised because there was no food in the area. The soldiers were constantly harassed by mounted archers, which surprised the Romans. Mithridates and Tigranes' war strategy was based on asymmetrical warfare tactics, which the Romans did not understand. These tactics were based on constantly chasing the enemy and making their speed and mobility difficult. The Romans were growing tired and hungry, and Mithridates' army was pursuing them. As discontent grew among Lucullus' soldiers, he encouraged a siege of Nisibis and captured the city. However, Mithridates' engineer Callimachos was among those defending the city and was killed on Lucullus' orders. Lucullus' leadership caused criticism among the soldiers, and the longing for Pompeius' leadership increased. Eventually, Mithridates' successful battle at Zela enabled him to retake Pontus, and Lucullus' army was disbanded. True to his new strategy, Mithridates retreated to western Armenia and help arrive to secure the kingdom of Tigranes. Lucullus marched with a large army to the point where the two kingdoms would meet. Tigranes advanced in Cappadocia, retaking the region for the third time since the beginning of the Mithridates Wars, but Lucullus sat helplessly. In Rome, the populist faction accused Lucullus of prolonging the war and robbing the palaces of Mithridates and Tigranes for his own gain. 52-year-old Lucullus was dismissed and his troops demobilized. In 66 BC, Gnaeus Pompeius was put in charge of the war against Mithridates. 40-year-old Pompeius had already organized 2 triumphal processions and met his old rival Lucullus in a village in Galatia. Lucullus spent his war profits on a life of such extravagance that he became known as Rome's most notorious debauchee and the most voracious man in Rome, loafing in luxurious villas and lavish banquets. Stories were told about Lucullus' lifestyle, with some praising him for bringing cherries to Italy. But after leaving command to Pompeius, Lucullus began to lose his sanity and died in 57 BC, according to some accounts, poisoned by an overdose of love potion. Rome and Pompeius could no longer ignore the crisis on the high seas. During the Mithridates Wars, pirate ships had invaded the Mediterranean, pillaging, plundering, and acting as they pleased. While Pompeius was engaged in the task of destroying the pirate hotbeds in the Mediterranean, Mithridates was rebuilding his power and restoring his fortunes from his headquarters in Pontus. Despite the failure of other expeditions against the pirates, Pompey skillfully pooled resources and captured or killed some 10,000 of the Mithras-worshipping pirates. Rome's comprehensive response to the threat of piracy persuaded most of the remaining pirates to settle on donated lands in Roman provinces. While Pompeius punished the pirates, Mithridates had a year to secure his kingdom, gather his armies, and ensure the safety of his remaining family members. Many Roman officers and soldiers had left Lucullus to join Mithridates. His contacts informed him in 66 BC that Pompeius the Great, who had been authorized to declare war on both Mithridates and Tigranes, was advancing on Pontus through Rhodes with a large army and navy. Pompey had even managed to ally himself with the king of Parthia. When Mithridates sent envoys to Pompeius and asked for terms for peace, Pompeius' blunt answer was unconditional surrender and the return of Roman traitors. Mithridates passed this answer on to the Romans in his own ranks, who encouraged the king to resist. Most of the soldiers agreed with their Roman comrades in arms. Mithridates is said to have vowed to resist with his loyal supporters. When he launched an attack on Pompeius' border outposts, Mithridates sent all of his infantry and the Romans retreated. Realizing the strength of Pompey's large forces, Mithridates retreated to a sheltered mountainous position in southeastern Pontus, where he dared not attack. However, Pompey kept the supply routes open, dug deep water wells, and besieged Mithridates in his new position. It is reported that Mithridates waited for Pompeius in the hope of finding food, but Pompeius managed to cut the supply lines. Finally, when Mithridates ran out of food, he is said to have saved the horses of the cavalry and 50 days' rations. According to some sources, wounded soldiers were also said to have suffered a humiliating death at the hands of the Romans. Mithridates and his army quietly retreated to another strong position. Mithridates' fleeing tactics were in keeping with the art of nomadic warfare and innovative guerrilla tactics. Many soldiers in Pompeius' army reportedly joined Mithridates. But in the end, at the Battle of Moonlight in late summer 66 BC, Pompeius' men killed and captured tens of thousands of Mithridates' warriors. Pompey captured Mithridates' camp and supplies. But Mithridates suffered casualties early in the battle and eventually managed to escape with his army. Mithridates' life was indeed full of adventure. His pursuit of Pompeius, crossing mountains and going so far as to astonish the Romans, make him a true legend. However, these great victories and military successes seem to have eventually led to dark times of their own. Jealousy, betrayal, and family conflicts seem to have led to restlessness and paranoia in his last years. No matter how powerful a man is, he always has his weaknesses, and Mithridates' case seems to be a case in point. Pharnake's betrayal and rebellion must have been a really challenging situation for Mithridates. It must have been a very painful experience for a father to have his son turn against him and seize the throne. The fact that Mithridates made an effort to persuade the crowd and then retreated to the castle suggests that he was perhaps struggling internally. At the same time, the use of religious symbols to legitimize Pharnake's accession to the throne in the eyes of the people reveals the symbolic dimension of the event. Such betrayals and family conflicts can occur at any time in history and may be inevitable for powerful leaders such as Mithridates. Mithridates' end, tragic and ironic as it was for the rest of his life, is thought-provoking on many levels. Faced with the fear of Roman capture and the betrayal of his son, the king had wanted to exile himself. In the end, however, he was forced to commit suicide because the situation had become too much for him to manage. The poison that brought Mithridates to his end was different from the poisons he had been accustomed to all his life. The fact that he had built up immunity by taking small doses of poison over many years may ironically have lessened the effect of the poison that ended his life. In addition, his compassion for his daughters and the fact that he shared the dose of poison to prevent harm to them was an important factor in determining his fate. Pharnake's announcement of his father's death and his portrayal of himself as a friend of Rome may have been a political move on his part. However, the unrecognizable markings on the corpse and Pompeius' attitude raise many questions about the end of Mithridates. Although Pompey treated Mithridates' corpse with respect, the fact remains that he was a major threat to Rome. Mithridates' death may have been seen as a symbol of Pompeius' victory. However, the facts behind this event show how Rome's dominance in the East was hard-won and how powerful leaders like Mithridates posed a threat. As a result, the end of Mithridates is both a historical event and an instructive lesson in understanding the complexities of human nature. The end of Mithridates and the mysteries he left behind are indeed interesting and thought-provoking. His lifetime of courage, resistance, and strategic genius earned him recognition as one of the greatest kings of antiquity. As Appianus notes, Mithridates' resistance to Rome was unprecedented, and his efforts to keep alive the ideal of freedom against Roman domination made him unforgettable. The aftermath of Mithridates' suicide seems to indicate that he was still at a great advantage. Pharnake's deception could conceal Mithridates' true escape and leave open the possibility of his reappearance. Pharnake's forgiveness of him, while indeed a surprising move, may be the result of his pragmatism and realism. Perhaps Mithridates saw his son's potential and believed that he could become a strong leader like himself. The various scenarios of Mithridates' escape keep our imagination running even after his death. It is unclear which path he chose and where he went, but this escape contributes to making his story and legacy even more mysterious. Moreover, the suggestion of how Hypsicrates emerged as Caesar's historian reads like the hero of a historical novel. Such events create a mysterious and alluring aura revolving around Mithridates. The life and end of Mithridates continues to capture the imagination not only of antiquity, but also of the modern age. His story tells of resistance, strategy, and the revolutionary spirit, while at the same time touching the depths of human nature. For this reason, the story of Mithridates seems to remain forever alive in the world of history and mythology.